My parents kicked me out because I looked too much like one race. I was 16 years old when my father told me to pack my things and leave because my face reminded him too much of his own father. Not because I'd done something terrible, not because I was failing school or doing drugs, but because every time he looked at me, he saw the Japanese heritage he'd spent his entire adult life trying to erase. My name is Kenji Nakamura Walsh, and I'm half Japanese, half Irish. My dad is the Japanese one, though you'd never know it from how he acts. He changed his name from Hiroshi Nakamura to Henry Walsh when he was 22, right after he married my mom. He wanted to assimilate, to be seen as American without qualifiers, and for the most part, he succeeded. He speaks perfect English with no accent, works in corporate finance, plays golf on weekends, and has never once mentioned his childhood in Osaka to anyone outside the family. My older brother Julian looks like Mom. Pale skin, red hair, green eyes. You'd never guess he had any Asian ancestry unless someone told you. Me, though, I got hit with every recessive gene my dad tried to bury. Dark hair, epicanthic folds, broader nose, and skin that tans deep brown in summer. I look undeniably Japanese, and my father hated me for it. Growing up, the difference in how they treated us was subtle at first. Julian got enrolled in expensive soccer camps while I got signed up for free programs at the community center. Julian's birthday parties were huge events with rented bounce houses and magicians, while mine were small gatherings with a grocery store cake. When Julian brought home C's, Dad would help him study for hours. When I brought home B's, he'd ask why they weren't A's and tell me to figure it out myself. My mom went along with everything, and I never understood why until much later. She loved my dad so completely that she'd convinced herself his behavior was normal, that he was just harder on me because I was the younger one and needed to learn independence. The cognitive dissonance must have been exhausting, but she maintained it for years. I learned early to make myself small, to not ask for things, to celebrate my own achievements quietly, without expecting recognition from them. The breaking point came the summer before my junior year. We were at a family reunion on my dad's side, the first one he'd agreed to attend in over a decade. His mother, my grandmother Yuki, had been sick, and the family pressured him into coming. She lived in a small house in San Francisco's Japantown, with my grandfather's ashes in an urn on the mantel, and photographs covering every surface. I'd only met her twice before, both times when I was too young to remember clearly. When we walked in, her face lit up the moment she saw me. She grabbed my face with both hands and said something in Japanese I didn't understand, tears streaming down her cheeks. My father's expression turned to stone. Later I heard him arguing her in the kitchen, switching between English and Japanese. I caught enough to understand she was saying I looked exactly like my grandfather Takeshi, her late husband, that I had his eyes, his smile, his spirit. My father responded in harsh whispers that I couldn't fully make out, but his body language was clear. He was angry that she'd made that comparison. The car ride home was silent and tense. Julian sat in the front seat scrolling his phone while I pressed myself against the back window, watching the city lights blur past. When we got home, Dad told me to go to my room. I obeyed, sitting on my bed for over an hour wondering what I'd done wrong. Finally, he came in without knocking and sat in my desk chair. He didn't look at me while he spoke, just stared at the wall behind my head. He said that seeing me with his mother had made him realize something, that I was a reminder of a past he'd worked hard to leave behind, that every time he looked at me, he saw his father's face, the man who'd struggled in America and never quite fit in. He said it wasn't my fault, but that my presence in the house was making it difficult for him to move forward with his life. I asked him what he meant, and he said I needed to find somewhere else to live for a while. Just temporarily, he claimed, until he could work through some things. My mom was waiting in the hallway when he left my room. I heard them talking in hushed voices, my mom asking if he was serious, my dad insisting it was necessary. She didn't fight very hard. That hurt almost as much as his rejection, the realization that she loved him more than she loved protecting me. I sat on my bed in shock for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just been said. Pack my things and leave? Where was I supposed to go? I was 16 years old with a part-time job at a movie theater making minimum wage. I had maybe $400 in my savings account. My phone buzzed with a text from Julian asking what was happening, but I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that your own father wants you gone because you look too much like the ethnicity he's ashamed of? I started pulling clothes out of my dresser, shoving them into a duffel bag while tears blurred my vision. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I called the only person I could think of who might help, my Uncle Daichi, my father's younger brother who still lived in San Francisco. He was the opposite of my dad in every way, proud of his heritage, involved in the Japanese-American community, and vocal about cultural preservation. They barely spoke because Dad found his activism embarrassing. Uncle Daichi picked up on the third ring, and I explained the situation through sobs. There was a long silence before he asked me to repeat what I'd just said, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. When I confirmed that yes, my father was kicking me out because I looked too Japanese, Uncle Daichi said words I'd never heard him use before. He told me to pack everything I cared about and that he'd be there in 3 hours. True to his word, his truck pulled up just after midnight. My parents were already in bed, or at least pretending to be. Julian helped me carry my boxes down the stairs without saying much, but I could see he was struggling with what to say. At the door, he hugged me tight and whispered that this was wrong, that he'd try to talk to Dad. I told him not to bother, that Dad had made his choice clear. Uncle Daiichi's apartment in Japantown was small but welcoming, filled with art and photographs that celebrated the culture my father rejected. He set me up in his spare room, which doubled as his home office, and made tea while I unpacked. We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about everything. He told me stories about growing up with my father, about how their dad Takeshi had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to provide for the family after immigrating, how my father had internalized shame about being different, about standing out, how he'd blamed their father for not assimilating faster, for maintaining Japanese traditions that made them targets for racism. Uncle Daiichi had gone the opposite direction, diving deep into their heritage as a form of resistance and pride. The brothers had drifted apart over the years, their philosophical differences creating an unbridgeable gap. Hearing this context didn't excuse what my father had done, but it helped me understand the twisted psychology behind it. He saw me as a mirror, reflecting everything he hated about himself, and he couldn't stand it. The first week at Uncle Daiichi's was an adjustment. I had to change schools, which meant enrolling at Lincoln High in San Francisco instead of the suburban school I'd attended since freshman year. Uncle Daiichi helped me register, explaining the situation to the counselors in vague terms about family conflict. They were surprisingly understanding, though I caught them exchanging concerned looks that told me they suspected something darker than what we were saying. My new school was completely different from my old one, more diverse, more crowded, more intense. I felt lost, navigating the hallways, trying to figure out where I fit. I sat alone at lunch for the first 3 days until a girl named May approached me and asked if I was new. She was Chinese-American, captain of the debate team, and had no patience for small talk. Within 5 minutes, she'd extracted my entire story, well, the sanitized version where I left out the part about my dad's self-hatred. She introduced me to her friend group, mostly other Asian American kids who welcomed me with an ease that felt foreign after years of being made to feel like an outsider in my own family. My mom called exactly once during that first month. She asked how I was settling in, if I needed anything, if I was eating properly. Her voice was strained, like she was reading from a script someone else had written. I asked her when I could come home, and there was a long pause before she said they were still figuring things out. I asked to talk to Julian, and she said he was at soccer practice. I asked if she missed me, and she started crying before hanging up. That was it. No follow-up calls, no texts, just silence. Julian texted me occasionally with updates. Dad had converted my room into a home gym. Mom had taken down all the family photos that included me. They'd told extended family on Mom's side that I was doing a foreign exchange program in Japan, which would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. My father had erased me from their lives with the efficiency of someone deleting an unwanted email. I wanted to be angry, and I was, but mostly, I felt hollow, like a part of me had been surgically removed, and I was still adjusting to the phantom pain. Uncle Daiichi enrolled me in Japanese language classes at the community center. He said if my father was going to reject me for looking Japanese, I might as well actually learn about the culture I apparently represented. I was resistant at first, still processing everything, but eventually I started going. My teacher, Mrs. Yoshida, was a 70-year-old woman who'd spent time in the internment camps during World War II. She had strong opinions about cultural preservation and no tolerance for self-hatred. When she learned my situation, she took a special interest in teaching me not just language, but history. The stories of Japanese-American resilience, the horror of the camps, the way the community rebuilt itself afterward. I started understanding that my father's shame wasn't just personal neurosis, it was generational trauma he'd never processed. That didn't excuse what he'd done to me, but it added layers to my understanding of why he was the way he was. Mrs. Yoshida also introduced me to my grandmother Yuki, who apparently she'd known for decades. Grandmother Yuki started inviting me over for dinner every week. She'd cook traditional meals and tell me stories about my grandfather Takeshi, the man whose face I apparently wore. He'd been an engineer who struggled to find work because of discrimination, eventually opening a small electronics repair shop that barely kept the family afloat. But he'd been kind and patient, always encouraging his sons to pursue education as a path to better opportunities. My father had taken that encouragement and twisted it into a mandate to erase himself. Uncle Daiichi had taken it as inspiration to fight for community recognition. 2 brothers, same father, completely different outcomes. School became a refuge. My grades improved dramatically without the constant stress of walking on eggshells at home. I joined the Asian Student Union, where I met other kids who'd dealt with identity struggles, though none quite as extreme as mine. There was something healing about being around people who didn't see my face as a problem to be solved. May convinced me to try out for the debate team, and to my surprise, I made it. Turns out years of having to justify my existence to my father had made me pretty good at constructing arguments. Our coach, Mr. Alvarez, was impressed with my research skills and aggressive cross-examination style. He started giving me increasingly complex topics to prepare, pushing me to think critically about social issues. One of our practice debates was about assimilation versus cultural preservation in immigrant communities, and I had to argue the assimilation side. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I presented my father's exact arguments about fitting in and not standing out, and then watched my teammate tear them apart with counter-arguments about the cost of erasing yourself. I went home that day and cried in my room for an hour. 6 months passed. Christmas came and went without any contact from my parents. Julian texted me a photo of their tree with all new ornaments, none of the handmade ones I'd crafted over the years visible. He said he'd asked about me during Christmas dinner, and Dad had changed the subject immediately. Mom had gotten up and left the table. The holidays were harder than I expected. Uncle Daichi tried to make it special, taking me to community events and introducing me to more extended family I'd never met. These were relatives my father had cut off years ago, aunts and uncles and cousins, who were shocked to learn of my existence. They welcomed me warmly, but I could see the sadness in their eyes when they looked at me. I was evidence of my father's shame, walking proof that you could try to erase your heritage, but it would show up in your children's faces anyway. My grandmother Yuki gave me a gift that made me break down completely. It was my grandfather Takeshi's watch, a simple Seiko he'd worn every day of his adult life. She said Takeshi would have wanted me to have it, that seeing me wear it would honor his memory. I put it on and haven't taken it off since. In March, something unexpected happened. My father's company was featured in a business magazine article about diversity in corporate leadership. The piece included photos of executives with their families, and my father had submitted an old photo that included me. Someone from the Japanese-American community recognized me from Uncle Daichi's social media and sent the magazine a message explaining that the son in the photo had been kicked out for looking too Asian. The magazine ran a follow-up piece about performative diversity and the internalized racism within minority communities. They didn't name my father directly, but anyone who knew him could connect the dots. His professional reputation took a hit. Colleagues started asking uncomfortable questions. His boss, who was Korean-American, called him in for a serious conversation about company values. The irony of my father facing professional consequences for the same ethnic heritage he'd rejected was not lost on me. Julian texted me that Dad was furious, convinced Uncle Daichi had orchestrated the whole thing. Uncle Daichi swore he hadn't, that he'd been as surprised as anyone when the article came out. Either way, the damage was done. 2 weeks after the article, my mom called, not to apologize, but to ask me to publicly deny the story. She said it was hurting Dad's career, damaging Julian's college prospects, making their lives difficult. I asked if she was serious, if she really expected me to lie to protect the man who'd thrown me away. She said I was being selfish, that I didn't understand how hard this was for them. I hung up on her. Uncle Daichi found me sitting on the floor of my room, shaking with rage and hurt. He sat down next to me without saying anything, just being present while I processed the sheer audacity of her request. After a while, he said something that stuck with me. He said my father had made choices that hurt me deeply, but that I didn't have to let those choices define the rest of my life, that I could choose to build something better, to be proud of who I was, regardless of whether they ever came around. It sounded like therapy speak, but coming from him, it felt genuine. He'd walked this path before me, navigating rejection and building a life centered on self-acceptance. If he could do it, maybe I could too. My junior year ended with surprising success. I'd made honor roll both semesters, placed third at a regional debate competition, and been nominated for a community service award for volunteering with Mrs. Yoshida's cultural preservation program. Lincoln High felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived before. May and I had become best friends, the kind where we could communicate in half sentences and inside jokes. She knew everything about my situation and never treated me like I was broken or pitiable, just accepted that this was my reality and helped me navigate it. Her family sort of adopted me too, inviting me to dinners and holidays. Her mom would pack extra lunch for me without asking, just slipping containers into my backpack when I visited. Her dad taught me how to change a tire and check oil, basic stuff my father had never bothered with. They never explicitly said they were trying to fill the gap my parents left, but their actions spoke clearly. I was grateful in ways I couldn't articulate. Summer brought unexpected news. My grandmother Yuki's health declined rapidly, the cancer she'd been quietly fighting for years finally winning. Uncle Daichi and I visited her in the hospital nearly every day. She was remarkably peaceful about dying, more concerned with making sure I was okay than with her own comfort. She made me promise to stay connected to my heritage, to teach my own children someday about where they came from. She said my grandfather would have been so proud of the young man I was becoming, that I carried his best qualities. In her final days, she asked to see my father. Uncle Daichi called him, and to my shock, he actually came. I wasn't there for their conversation, but Uncle Daichi said it was painful to witness. My father cried, something Uncle Daichi said he'd never seen before. Grandmother Yuki told him he'd made a terrible mistake with me, that he was letting fear destroy his family. My father apparently just nodded and cried harder. She died 3 days later with both her sons at her bedside. I sat in the waiting room, not sure if I was supposed to be there or not. The funeral was the first time I'd seen my parents in almost a year. They arrived separately from me and Uncle Daichi, sitting on the opposite side of the funeral home. My mom looked older, more tired. My father looked hollow, like someone had scooped out his insides and left just the shell. Julian sat between them, visibly uncomfortable. During the service, various family members spoke about grandmother Yuki's strength and grace. Uncle Daiichi spoke about her resilience during the internment camps and her dedication to community. When it was my father's turn, he walked to the front and stood silent for almost a full minute. Then he started talking about growing up, about how his mother had sacrificed everything so he and Uncle Daiichi could have opportunities, how she'd worked multiple jobs, learned English late in life, navigated systems designed to exclude her, how she'd done it all with dignity and without complaint. His voice broke when he said he'd repaid her sacrifices by rejecting everything she'd tried to teach him about pride and identity. He said he'd made choices he deeply regretted, hurt people he loved because he was afraid of being seen as different. He didn't look at me while he said it, but everyone in the room knew he was talking about me. After the service, extended family gathered at Uncle Daiichi's apartment for a traditional reception. My parents arrived late and kept their distance from me at first. I saw my mom starting toward me several times before turning away. My father stayed in a corner nursing the same glass of whiskey for an hour. Julian finally came over and hugged me tight, saying he'd missed me and everything was messed up at home. He said our parents barely spoke to each other anymore, that Mom blamed Dad for ruining the family and Dad blamed himself, but wouldn't admit it out loud. I asked if he thought they'd ever apologize, and Julian said Dad was too proud and Mom was too complicit. We stood together in silence until my father approached. He stood in front of me with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. He said he was sorry for what he'd done, that he'd been wrong, that he'd let his own issues damage me in ways he was only beginning to understand. I asked if that meant I could come home. He said they'd sold the house and were moving to a smaller place, that my room didn't exist anymore. The metaphor was too perfect. Even in apologizing, he was telling me there was no space for me in his life. I wish I could say I forgave him in that moment, that we had some tearful reconciliation, and rebuilt our relationship. But real life isn't that neat. I told him I appreciated the apology, but wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine. He nodded like he expected that response, and walked away. My mom approached next, mascara running down her face. She said she was sorry too, that she should have protected me, that she'd chosen wrong when she chose her marriage over her son. I asked her why she'd done it, and she said she didn't know, that she'd convinced herself Dad was going through something temporary and I'd be fine with Uncle Daiichi, that she'd been lying to herself for so long she didn't know how to stop. I told her I loved her, but couldn't trust her right now. She sobbed openly and left the apartment. Julian followed her out, giving me one last hug before he went. I watched them drive away and felt nothing. The grief had burned itself out months ago, leaving behind just a kind of distant observation of people who used to matter. Senior year started with renewed purpose. I threw myself into applications for college and scholarships. My debate coach helped me craft essays that turned my experience into a narrative about resilience and identity formation. I didn't sugarcoat what had happened, but I framed it as something that had forced me to develop independence and strength. Several schools responded positively, particularly programs focused on Asian American studies and social justice. I got accepted to UC Berkeley with a full scholarship funded by a Japanese American community organization. The irony that my father's rejection had led me to opportunities within the community he'd rejected wasn't lost on anyone. Uncle Daiichi cried when I showed him the acceptance letter. Mrs. Yoshida threw me a celebration party at the community center. May made me promise we'd stay friends even though she was going to UCLA. My grandmother would have been proud. My parents sent a card congratulating me on Berkeley. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note saying they wanted to contribute to my future, even if they couldn't fix the past. I deposited the check and didn't respond. Julian called to say they'd hoped I'd call to thank them, and I explained that money wasn't an apology and didn't erase what they'd done. He sounded disappointed, but not surprised. He'd gotten into a good school on the East Coast and was planning to leave as soon as possible. He said living with them had become unbearable, that the guilt and unspoken tensions were suffocating. I told him Uncle Daiichi's couch was always available if he needed an escape. He said he might take me up on that. We'd been thrust into adult situations neither of us had chosen, but at least we had each other. The sibling bond had survived even when parental bonds had shattered. Graduation came in June. Uncle Daiichi was there cheering loudly when I walked across the stage. May's family came and treated it like I was their son. Mrs. Yoshida brought flowers. I saw my parents in the back row, but they left immediately after the ceremony without trying to talk to me. Julian found me afterward and gave me a gift from them, a framed photo of the four of us from when I was 8, before everything fell apart. On the back, my father had written a long message about regret and wishing he could undo his choices. I read it once and put it in a box with other things from my old life. Maybe someday I'd want to look at it again. Maybe someday I'd be ready to forgive fully. But that day wasn't today, and forcing it wouldn't help anyone. Healing happens on its own timeline, not according to someone else's guilt-driven schedule. Uncle Daiichi told me I was wise beyond my years. I told him I'd had no choice but to grow up fast. The summer before college, I worked full-time at Uncle Daiichi's architecture firm doing basic office work. He'd built a successful practice designing buildings that incorporated Japanese aesthetic principles into modern structures. I'd never paid much attention to architecture before, but watching him work was fascinating. He explained how spaces could honor heritage while serving contemporary needs, how design could make a statement about identity and belonging. I started thinking about my own life in those terms. I was building something new from the ruins of what my father had destroyed, incorporating pieces of my heritage he'd rejected, creating a self that was authentically mine. It felt like important work, this construction of identity in the aftermath of rejection. Uncle Daichi said I was thinking like an architect. I said I was thinking like a survivor. Berkeley's campus overwhelmed me at first. So many students, so much energy, so many opportunities. I'd declared Asian American Studies as my major with a minor in psychology. I wanted to understand the psychological mechanisms behind internalized racism, to study how generations of discrimination could create the kind of self-hatred my father exhibited. My first semester courses included Introduction to Asian American History, where I learned about the specific policies and social forces that had shaped communities like my family. The professor, Dr. Tanaka, had lived through the internment camps as a child. Her lectures were powerful, weaving personal narrative with historical analysis. I went to her office hours and shared my story. She nodded like she'd heard variations of it 1,000 times before. She said every Asian American community dealt with these tensions between assimilation and preservation, that my father's response was extreme, but not unique. She became my advisor and mentor, guiding my academic development over the next 4 years. My relationship with my parents remained distant, but not completely severed. We progressed to occasional phone calls where we discussed surface-level topics, school, weather, Julian's progress on the East Coast. My father never quite apologized in a way that satisfied me, always hedging his remorse with explanations about his own trauma and upbringing. My mom tried harder, but couldn't escape her own guilt enough to be fully present. We all understood that the family we'd been was gone, replaced by something more formal and distant. Julian became the bridge between us, sharing updates and trying to maintain connections nobody else had the energy for. He'd visit me at Berkeley sometimes, staying with me in my dorm and marveling at how different my life had become. He said he was proud of me for building something good from something terrible. I told him I was proud of him for acknowledging what had happened instead of pretending everything was fine. Honesty, even painful honesty, felt like the only path forward. During my sophomore year, I started volunteering with a community organization that supported Asian American youth dealing with identity issues. Many of the kids I worked with were struggling with exactly the kind of familial rejection and cultural shame I'd experienced. Listening to their stories was both triggering and healing, forcing me to process my own trauma while helping others navigate theirs. I developed workshops about cultural identity, internalized racism, and family dynamics. Dr. Tanaka helped me design curriculum that was academically sound but accessible to teenagers. The work felt meaningful in ways I hadn't experienced before. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was using my survival to help others. That transformation from victim to advocate was empowering. Uncle Daichi said I'd found my calling. Mrs. Yoshida said my grandfather would be proud. I said I was proud of myself, which felt like the most important thing. My junior year brought an unexpected development. A filmmaker working on a documentary about internalized racism in Asian American families found my story through the community organization. She asked if I'd be willing to share my experience on camera. I was hesitant, not wanting to publicly expose my parents or relive the trauma. But Uncle Daichi encouraged me, saying that stories like mine needed to be told if things were ever going to change. I agreed on the condition that the focus would be on healing and community support, not just on victimization. The filming process was intense, sitting under lights answering questions about the worst period of my life. But I also got to talk about Uncle Daichi's support, Grandmother Yuki's wisdom, the community that had embraced me. The documentary included interviews with other people who'd experienced similar rejections, creating a tapestry of pain, but also resilience. It premiered at a film festival in Los Angeles, and I brought Uncle Daichi, May, and Mrs. Yoshida. Watching my story on screen was surreal, but also validating. The audience response was overwhelming, people crying and sharing their own stories afterward. The documentary got picked up by a streaming service, and suddenly my story was accessible to millions of people. Messages poured in from Asian Americans who'd dealt with similar family dynamics, expressing gratitude for making them feel less alone, but also from parents who'd recognized their own behavior and wanted to do better. One message particularly struck me, from a Japanese American man about my father's age. He wrote that watching the documentary had made him realize he'd been doing similar things to his own children, pushing them to minimize their Asian identity to fit in better. He said he was starting therapy and trying to repair the damage. If my story could prompt even one parent to change course, maybe the pain had served some purpose beyond just my own growth. The thought was both comforting and sad. I wished my father had seen that message. I wished a lot of things. My father did eventually watch the documentary. Julian told me he'd streamed it alone in his apartment and called him afterward crying. He'd never explicitly said he was wrong before, had only danced around the edges of apology. But after watching the documentary, he sent me a long email taking full responsibility. He wrote about his own father's struggles, the discrimination he'd witnessed, the shame he'd internalized as a child, how he'd promised himself he'd never let his children experience that pain, and how he'd chosen the exact wrong strategy for preventing it. By trying to erase the part of me that looked Asian, he'd inflicted a different but equally damaging trauma. He said he understood if I never forgave him, that he didn't deserve it, but he wanted me to know he was getting therapy and trying to understand what he'd done. The email was raw and honest, in a way he'd never been before. I read it multiple times before responding. I told him I appreciated his honesty and was glad he was working on himself, that I couldn't promise we'd ever have a traditional father-son relationship, but that I was open to seeing where things went. It felt like a small opening, not forgiveness exactly, but not complete rejection either. Senior year focused on my thesis project. I researched the long-term psychological impacts of family rejection on Asian American youth, combining quantitative data with qualitative interviews. The work was emotionally exhausting, essentially academizing my own trauma and that of others. But Dr. Tanaka guided me through it, reminding me why this research mattered. My thesis defense was attended by family and friends, Uncle Daichi in the front row beaming with pride. I'd also invited my parents, unsure if they'd come. They showed up wearing formal clothes, sitting in the back and looking uncomfortable. Hearing me present academic research about the harm they'd caused must have been brutal. Afterward, my father approached and said he was proud of me, that the work was important. I thanked him, and for the first time in years, we hugged. It wasn't a magical healing moment. We still had miles to go, but it was something. A small step toward reconciliation, built on honesty rather than pretending nothing had happened. I graduated with highest honors and multiple job offers from nonprofits focused on Asian American community development. I accepted a position with an organization in San Francisco, which meant staying close to Uncle Daichi and the community that had raised me when my parents couldn't. The work involved developing programs to support Asian American families navigating cultural identity issues, essentially institutionalizing the kind of help I'd received. My parents attended graduation, and this time they stayed for the celebration afterward. We took photos together, the first family photos in 5 years. Looking at them later, I could see the distance in our body language, the way we weren't quite comfortable standing close to each other. But we were trying, which was more than I'd thought possible a few years earlier. Julian joked that we looked like strangers forced to pose together, which wasn't entirely wrong. We were essentially strangers, trying to figure out if we could become something more. My relationship with my parents continues to be complicated. We have monthly dinners now where we're carefully polite, avoiding topics that might trigger conflict. My father talks about his therapy, the insights he's gaining, the cultural programming he's trying to unpack. My mom focuses on the present and future, seemingly unable or unwilling to fully examine the past. I talk about my work, the families I'm helping, the changes I'm seeing in the community. Julian attends when he's in town, serving as buffer and translator when conversations get tense. It's not the family dynamic I grew up wanting, but it's functional in its own way. Uncle Daichi says healing isn't linear, that some relationships will always carry scars even after they've mended. I've accepted that my relationship with my parents will never be what it could have been. The foundation was too badly cracked, the betrayal too deep. But we're building something new on top of the ruins, and that's worth something. Looking back at that night when my father told me to leave, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd reacted differently. If I'd begged to stay, promised to change something about myself, maybe gotten surgery to look less Asian. The thought makes me sick now. But at 16, I was desperate enough to consider anything. Instead, I left and found Uncle Daichi, Grandmother Yuki, Mrs. Yoshida, May, Dr. Tanaka, an entire community of people who taught me that my face wasn't something to apologize for. They taught me that assimilation wasn't worth the cost my father had paid, that you could be fully American while honoring your heritage. These lessons felt revolutionary after growing up in a household where Asian identity was something to minimize and hide. I'm grateful my father kicked me out, which is a strange thing to say, but that rejection forced me to find a better family, one built on acceptance rather than shame. The work I do now helps other kids avoid the worst of what I went through. We can't stop all family rejection, people's trauma and fears run too deep, but we can create safety nets, support systems, and communities that catch people when their families fail them. Every kid I help feels like honoring my grandfather Takeshi, the man whose face I wear and whose values I try to embody. Uncle Daichi says I'm doing the work our family needed a generation ago, preventing the cycle of shame from continuing. It's heavy responsibility sometimes, carrying other people's pain while still processing my own, but it's also deeply fulfilling, turning my worst experience into something that helps others. My grandmother Yuki said in one of our last conversations that suffering either destroys us or teaches us compassion. I chose compassion, which doesn't erase the pain, but at least gives it purpose. I'm 23 now, 7 years removed from that night my father told me to pack my things. I have a career I love, a found family that supports me, and a complicated but improving relationship with my biological family. I'm dating someone who thinks my face is beautiful, who grew up in a Japanese-American family that celebrated heritage rather than hiding it. Uncle Daichi is talking about retiring and has offered me his architecture firm, saying I understand space and identity better than anyone he knows. I'm considering it, thinking about how buildings and programs both create spaces where people can be themselves. Mrs. Yoshida is elderly now but still teaches, and I assist with her classes, helping the next generation learn the language and culture my father tried to abandon. These activities fill my life with meaning that has nothing to do with my parents' acceptance or rejection. I've built something that stands independent of their approval, which feels like the ultimate victory. My father and I will never have the relationship I wanted as a child. That possibility died the night he chose his shame over his son. But we have something else now, something more honest, if less comfortable. We acknowledge what happened, accept that it changed us permanently, and try to move forward with realistic expectations. My mom is learning to live with her guilt, which manifests as overcompensating attempts to support me now. She donates to my organization, volunteers at community events, tries to learn about the culture she allowed her husband to reject. It's too little too late in some ways, but it's something. Julian and I remain close, united by shared trauma and determination to not repeat our parents' mistakes when we have families of our own. We talk about breaking cycles, about doing better, about honoring the parts of ourselves that others wanted us to erase. These conversations matter more than my parents' belated apologies ever could. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.